The first federal execution in 17 years occurred this morning at 8:07 a.m. when Daniel Lewis Lee was executed by the federal government via lethal injection. Let's talk about all of that. Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome to Law-Splaining the Interwebs. I'm your host, Nick Rekieta of Rekieta Law, a small law firm in central Minnesota. And today we're talking about the federal death penalty, not the state death penalties for any particular states. This is federal death penalties with federal death row inmates. And there is a pretty big distinction there. So this morning at 8:07 a.m., the first federal execution in 17 years took place, and it's also the first federal execution to use pentobarbital, which is a single drug lethal injection method of execution. Prior to this, they used a 3-drug method of execution, which was challenged and then became a problem for other reasons that we'll get to in a little bit. But I wanted to talk briefly about my personal opinion on the death penalty, and because I want to properly set this, the tone of this video, and I properly want to set my opinions on it, so there's no illusions about my perspective. All right, I'm not trying to sell you anything on the death penalty. I used to be very much in favor of the death penalty, thinking that at some point there's a level where we go, okay, this person is just needs to be completely removed from society. And that's a fine view to have. I actually don't have too much of a problem with people who have that view still. My views, as I became more libertarian and associated with freedom, liberty, and distrust of the state, says that I recognize the state's ability and right, I guess, to remove a citizen from society, but I don't have much faith in the state's ability to make a proper determination about who should be removed and who shouldn't. So my distrust of the state has distanced me from thinking that the state is actually competent rather than just capable of killing its citizens. I don't want the state to ever kill its own citizens. I think that's a little bit of an anathema to the idea of participating in a system of government that we have, a representative republic. But that's just me, and I don't have any problem with the death penalty as a whole. I don't have any problem with executions, and I'm certainly not championing in the streets to have murderers not executed. I think there are way more pressing concerns in our country than that. I just think as a personal and principle matter, that I'm not too fond of the state killing people, and I'm not too confident in their ability to do it appropriately. But that out of the way, let's talk about Daniel Lewis Lee, who is yet more evidence that people with 3 first names are terrifying and should be avoided at all costs. Daniel Lewis Lee was convicted in 1996 for the killing of 3 members of a family. He's a self-professed white supremacist, and he and a couple other people had maybe this weird idea of taking over the Pacific Northwest and setting it up as a separate white-only nation. It sounds like a weird idea today because, you know, Seattle, Portland, they don't seem like they would be on board with that sort of idea. But maybe things were different in 96. I don't know. Maybe they liked the weather. It doesn't really matter. That was kind of their grandiose plan. And these murders were done as part of a gun trafficking attempt. So their idea was to steal a bunch of guns from people, and they did this, steal a bunch of guns from this family. A gun shop owner was the father of the family. Steal a bunch of guns and then sell those guns to various people, and then use, you know, that money to help fund their utopian paradise of white supremacy in the Pacific Northwest. It makes perfect sense. All right. It's a logical plan, but this is what they did back in 1996. And let's do this. Let's take a brief look at this case, and then we're going to talk about why there haven't been any federal executions since 2003. There have been state executions. People have been executed in multiple states since 2003. That is a completely separate issue. Federal executions have been on hold for some very specific reasons, which we'll talk about. But let's talk a little bit about Daniel Lewis Lee and his case, just for a minute here. And right below me, there is a list of federal death row prisoners, and this is it's not a list. This is a demographic breakdown of federal death row prisoners, and what it's gonna do is kind of illustrate one of the reasons there haven't been many federal executions at all, much less since 2003. There's only 61 total federal death row inmates. In Texas, that's like a weekend of convictions. I kid a little bit, but no, typically you're not convicting people for murder under federal crimes or under federal law unless there's a specific federal crime, or unless the crime involves like kidnapping and transporting across states and then a killing or something like that. There are specific reasons why you would have a federal death penalty rather than just being convicted in state prison. So that explains part of it, but we'll get into the rest of it in a little bit. But that's from the Death Penalty Info Center, which is a really interesting, albeit very biased website that is opposed to the death penalty, but you can get a lot of good information. You can actually see all of the federal death row prisoners that are currently sitting, and you can read about all of their crimes and their convictions and their case histories. It's a pretty cool website. Lots of info there. You guys should check it out. But that's where the infographic is from. But I thought it helpful to illustrate kind of the breakdown of gender, race, and just seriously the small number of federal death row inmates that there are. Because I think people may be under the impression that there's just a ton of them because the feds can do death penalties in states that can't, but it's really not true. I don't know if people are actually under that impression. I just think some people might be. Anyway, so here it is. Daniel Lewis Lee, executed for torturing, killing Arkansas family in 1996. First federal execution in 17 years. Weird picture there. Here's him in court. A self-proclaimed white supremacist who tortured and killed an Arkansas family, including an 8-year-old girl, was executed Tuesday morning in Indiana. Daniel Lewis Lee was injected with a lethal dose of pentobarbital at 8:07 a.m., just hours after the Supreme Court greenlit the first federal execution to take place since 2003. And yes, they tried to get a stay on his execution all the way up to the very last minute. And the last attempt to get the stay on the execution was due to coronavirus. It was interestingly supported by both Daniel Lewis Lee and the families of his victims, because the family of his victims included elderly people who wanted to watch the execution but feared traveling to a federal prison due to coronavirus concerns. Now, that's a little bit... there are a lot of coronavirus cases happening in prisons, but in the particular prison where Daniel Lee was going to be executed, there have been a very limited number. And it's not like they're going to have a lot of contact with the prison population that would be infected with coronavirus. The Supreme Court basically said, no. Look, there's going to be a lot of precautions taken. There's all sorts of stuff with temperature checks and face mask requirements and social distancing that are going to allow this execution to take place. We're not going to delay an execution because of the coronavirus. That's just silly. Now, and there was no longer an ability for Daniel to appeal his death penalty overall. It was literally just a delay game going on here. But once the injunction on federal executions generally was lifted a while back, they had started planning for Daniel Lee's execution at that point, and then it was scheduled. And the Supreme Court did also determine that that once these things are kind of in place and get to a certain point, it's really burdensome on the government to cancel all that and reschedule it. So they said, no, the execution's going to go on. So then it did. All right. And again, we're going to talk about that 2003 stuff in a minute. But so he was wheeled into the execution chamber in the federal penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana. strapped into a gurney with more than half his body covered in a light blue blanket. IV tubes were coming through a metal panel in the walls, and Lee breathed heavily before the drug was injected into his body, moving his legs and feet. He mumbled to himself briefly as his chest continued to rise and fall. At one point, as the drug was being administered, he raised his head to look around. With his head cocked slightly to the left, his breathing appeared to become labored. In a few moments, Lee's chest was no longer moving. His lips turned blue, and his fingers became ashy. So he was convicted of multiple offenses, including 3 counts of murder in the aid of racketeering in the 1996 slayings of William Frederick Mueller, his wife Nancy Ann Mueller, and their 8-year-old and his 8-year-old stepdaughter Sarah Elizabeth Powell in Arkansas. Mueller was a local gun dealer, and the bodies of him and his family were discovered 5 months after they went missing. They had been shot to death and had plastic bags covering their heads, sealed with duct tape. Now, this is weird because I read that they were killed with, they were shot with a stun gun, and then the plastic bags were sealed over their heads. I'm not quite sure which is true on that, but it doesn't really matter. They were killed in a pretty terrible way. Their bodies were weighed down by rocks and dumped in an Illinois bayou. I didn't do it, Lee said on Tuesday, looking directly into the window of the media witness room before he was executed. I've made a lot of mistakes in my life, but I'm not a murderer. His last words, "You're killing an innocent man." Now, was Daniel Lewis Lee an innocent man? I don't think so. There's a whole lot to suggest that he actually participated in the killings, although he may have objected at the time of actually killing. There's not really any evidence to support that. And there's a lot to support the fact that he actively participated in the killing of these 3 people. But, you know, last words are last words, and you give them as much credit as you want to give them. That's up to you. Why was this the first execution since 2003? I think that's the next question to address and kind of the educational or informative part of this video outside of just who this guy was. All right. So, some people were prosecuted under a 1988 federal statute, which was related to violence during drug transactions. And that's kind of an important reason as to why these people were convicted in federal court rather than state court, because a federal law about murdering people during a drug transaction would add a separate offense to the otherwise existing offense of murder or manslaughter or whatever that these guys would be tried for under state court. So this was a law passed during the war on drugs. It was an attempt to reduce drug use in the United States, and it obviously did very well. Sorry, sarcasm for the war on drugs. I should be. It was not a smashing success, but some people were convicted in federal court for murders related to drug transactions. And in 2003, when those people's executions became sort of imminent, they challenged the method by which they would be executed. And when I say that, there's some context that needs to be kind of surrounding that. And let me explain it real quick. The way the federal government does executions is the federal government will convict someone in federal court, and then they will be assigned to a state to do executions, and the state will carry, and it could be related to the crime, or it could be related to where the trial is, or it could be related to something else. For example, the guy who killed Drew Shodine was convicted in North Dakota, but North Dakota hasn't killed anyone since like 1905. And so they actually assigned him to be executed in South Dakota, which isn't much, hasn't executed many more people since then either, but they assigned the execution to South Dakota because North Dakota didn't have any execution procedures in place, whereas South Dakota had some on the books for the feds to follow. Now, he hasn't been executed yet, but either way, that's kind of how they do it. They pick a state that is, either where the conviction occurs or where is somewhat nearby to actually carry out the execution. And then the federal government follows the execution procedures of the states. And so back in 2003, these guys were appealing that execution procedure, partly on the grounds of the drug that was being administered at the time, which was a 3-drug combination. And there was some drama about those drugs a couple years ago. In particular, one of them, I don't remember the drug's name, but back in 2011, a bunch of lobbyists lobbied the pharmaceutical companies and demanded them and convinced them to stop distributing the drug to prisons to do the lethal injection. So there was an artificial shortage on one of the lethal injection drugs, and that kind of gained some popularity and awareness because of this case, Roan versus Holder. If anyone's curious about the case, Roan versus Holder was the case, and it's now Roan v. Barr, because obviously it was the Attorney General that they were dealing with. And anyway. But that's not the only thing they were challenging. They were also challenging the minutia related to the execution as well. So we're talking about things like last meals. We're talking about having their drapes open and closed at particular times, having them be informed that it was their execution day at a particular way, at a particular time, and all of this stuff. And the federal government had some guidelines created on how to do this, and they were challenging they were challenging the federal adherence to the state execution methods. And the appeals court finally this year said, look, this is a bit much. This is putting the federal government and their manual on how to do something into some sort of list that could be challenged up to the last moment and indefinitely delay executions. And that's not really what the purpose of this is. The delays in execution should be related to 8th Amendment concerns or other constitutional rights. Your 8th Amendment right to be free from, cruel and unusual punishments, right? Cruel and unusual punishments. So they have not really challenged their executions on 8th Amendment grounds. And the big problem is because of the new drug that they're using, which is pentobarbital, which is what Daniel Lewis Lee was killed with earlier today. And pentobarbital is a single drug that has no evidence other than putting someone basically to sleep and then killing them. That's what it does. There's no current evidence that is substantial regarding unreasonable amounts of pain or suffering being associated with it. And it's been used in, I think it's in use currently in 5 states, and none of those states have received challenges about the cruel and unusual aspect of pentobarbital. It's seen as largely the most humane way to execute someone in the United States right now. So because of that, there were no more substantive challenges, no more constitutional challenges. Daniel Lewis Lee was executed today, but it all kind of went back to the idea of this 2003 case clearing the way earlier this year by being overturned on appeals and saying that, look, these challenges to the procedure of the execution, and part of that challenge was how to precisely put the catheter into the vein to inject the drug, right? But I mean, you can go to pretty much any clinic on earth and you'll get a nurse who can put a catheter into a vein. So why there would be a minutia laden procedure for inserting a needle into someone's arm, that's another thing where the appeals court is like, this is too much. Like, this is just ridiculous that we're quibbling over whether a nurse can properly insert a needle into a vein. Of course they can. They do it a billion times a day. So that's kind of the status of where we are. There are 3 more inmates with scheduled executions in the very near future, and they will probably be carried out fairly soon here. And when they are, I may cover them because it's pretty interesting to look at what people are convicted for, what those crimes are, why they're being executed, and all of that. And if you guys are interested in that type of stuff, or if you want to hear about historical death row cases, please drop it in the comments below. Maybe I'll look into it. There's always a story behind a death row murder, because something had to convince 12 jurors to say, yeah, not only does this person guilty, but we want them gone forever. So they're usually pretty interesting cases. And if you want me to talk about them, drop them in the description. I'll see if I can look them up, and we'll do some videos like that. All right, guys. I hope you enjoyed learning about the first federal execution in 17 years. Seems like an all-around charming individual, and it's there's some weird case law that went into making this delay, but he is now gone, and we'll see what happens next. Hope you found this informative and insightful. If you did, go ahead, hit like and subscribe, and we'll talk to you soon. Have a good day. Peace. Peace.